You have been lied to, not by science, not by religion, but by the way you were taught to ask questions. Ever since you were a child, someone placed a ceiling over your curiosity. They told you that certain questions were dangerous, or worse, convinced you that some questions simply have no answer, and you, like most people, accepted that. You put it away in some drawer of your mind and went on with your life. But today that drawer opens because there is a question that has haunted humanity for more than 3,000 years. A question that has made theologians sweat, made atheists smile with superiority, and left philosophers going around in circles without getting anywhere. If God created the universe, who created God? Have you heard it? You have probably said it. Maybe you once used it in an argument to shut someone up. Or maybe someone said it to you and you did not know how to respond. And here is what no one has honestly told you. Everyone who has used that question from either side has been wrong. The atheist who throws it like an intellectual bomb, the believer who awkwardly avoids it, the philosopher who has spent centuries trying to answer it. They have all fallen into the same trap. The trap of assuming that the question is properly formulated. It is not. And Einstein, yes, Albert Einstein, left behind the reasoning that proves it, not in a sermon, not in a religious manifesto, but in the mathematical structure of time itself. But before we get there, I need you to understand something that is going to make part of your brain uncomfortable, because your mind, the mind of any human being, was designed by millions of years of evolution to look for causes, to ask why, to find who is responsible for everything that happens. That did not save life on the African savanna. If you heard a noise in the bushes, your brain did not stop to do philosophy. It assumed a cause, assumed danger, and made you run. That same mechanism that kept us alive is the one that now works against us at the limits of existence. Because there are questions that seem profound, that sound intelligent, that generate passionate debates, but that are built on an error so basic that no one stops to see it. They are like asking, what is south of the South Pole? The question has the form of a question, it has a subject, a verb, and everything it grammatically needs, but it does not point to any real place. Who created God? It is exactly that kind of question. And the problem is not the answer. The problem is that we have spent centuries fighting to answer it without anyone having had the courage or clarity to stop and ask whether the question itself makes sense. That is what we are going to do here. I am not going to sell you certainties. I am not going to tell you that science explains everything, nor that faith resolves what reason cannot. What I am going to offer you is something much more valuable and much rarer. The possibility of leaving this video thinking in a way you could not before. Because when Einstein was working on his theory of general relativity, he was not thinking about God, he was thinking about gravity, about space, about how massive objects bend reality around them. But what he discovered almost accidentally was something that changes the entire debate about creation. He discovered that time is not the stage on which the universe happens. Time is a property of the universe. Time was born with the universe. And if that is true, if time itself began with a Big Bang, then asking what existed before the universe is like asking what is north of absolute north. The question does not fail because of a lack of an answer, it fails because the concept of before did not exist before anything existed. And that small detail that fits into a single sentence, destroys the most widely used argument in 3,000 years of philosophical debate about God. It does not prove the atheist right, it does not prove the traditional believer right, it strikes at the misapplied logic that both have been using without realizing it. Stay, because what comes next permanently transforms the way you understand existence. For more than 3,000 years, humanity has tried to answer a question that, as we are already beginning to see, may never have been properly formulated. But to understand why that question is a mistake, we first have to understand how we got here, because this story does not begin with Einstein, it begins much earlier. It begins when human beings first raised their eyes to the sky and felt that there was something too orderly, too precise, too immense to be accidental. The Greek philosophers of the 6th century BC were the first to attempt to systematize that instinct. Anaximander, a thinker who lived on the coast of what is now Turkey, asked himself a question that none of his contemporaries had dared to formulate with such clarity. If everything has an origin, if every effect has a cause, then the chain of causes must end somewhere. There must be something that began everything without itself having been begun by anything. He did not call it God, he called it the apeiron, the indefinite, the unlimited. A primordial source without form, without beginning and without end, from which everything emerges and to which everything returns. It was an extraordinary idea for its time and planted a seed that would take centuries to grow into a tree. Aristotle took that seed and built one of the most influential arguments in the entire history of human thought. He called it the unmoved mover. His logic was almost hypnotic in its simplicity. Everything that moves is moved by something. That something was moved by something else, and that other thing by another. But this chain cannot be infinite because then nothing would ever have begun to move. Therefore, there must be a first mover, something that moves without having been moved, a cause that does not need a cause. That concept traveled centuries forward, crossed cultures, survived empires, and reached the Middle Ages in the hands of Thomas Aquinas, the Dominican theologian who became the intellectual architect of modern Catholicism. Quino took Aristotle's unmoved mover and identified it directly with the Christian God. God is the uncaused cause, the necessary being, that which exists by its own nature and gives existence to everything else. For centuries, that argument was practically unquestionable in the West. It was elegant, it was logical within its own terms, and it gave religion a philosophical foundation that seemed rock solid until the 20th century arrived. In 1948, the British philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell took part in a radio debate that would become legendary. His opponent was the Jesuit priest Frederick Cleston, one of the most brilliant Catholic intellectuals of his generation. And in that debate, Russell made an observation that still resonates. If everything that exists needs a cause, then God also needs a cause. And if God can exist without a cause, then the universe can also exist without a cause. In either case, the argument of the unmoved mover proves nothing that we cannot apply directly to the universe itself. It was a clean, precise, philosophically devastating blow. And the question that gave this video its title, that question that millions of people have used ever since as though it were an intellectual revelation, was born from exactly that kind of reasoning. If God created the universe, who created God? It sounds profound. It sounds as though it exposes an irreconcilable contradiction in religious thought. But this is where things become interesting, and this is where most people, including many who consider themselves serious thinkers, stop too soon, because Russell was right to point out the logical inconsistency of the classical argument. That is undeniable, but he himself was still operating within a mental framework that Einstein was already dismantling during that same historical period. Russell was still assuming, as we all instinctively do, that causality operates within a time that simply exists, that time is the universal container within which all causes and all effects unfold. And if that assumption is false, the entire debate changes its nature. This is not a minor detail, it is the entire foundation on which the question was built, because both Aquinas' argument and Russell's response assume that it makes sense to talk about what happened before the universe. Both assume that there was a moment when the universe did not exist and that something or someone acted at that moment to create it. But what if that moment never existed? What if before the universe is an empty category? Not because we lack information about that period, but because the very concept of a period requires time, and time did not exist. That is not a mystical evasion, it is not a religious answer that dodges the question, it is physics, it is mathematics, it is the direct consequence of what Einstein demonstrated with general relativity. And understanding that, truly understanding it in its full implications, not merely as a fact but as reality, requires you to be willing to let go of something your brain has spent your entire life assuming was obvious. If you subscribe to the channel, well done, because right there, at that point where physics speaks to philosophy, is where this video is going to take your mind to a place few conversations dare to enter. In 1915, Albert Einstein published something that changed forever: the way humanity understands reality. It was not a manifesto, it was not a speech, it was 10 equations. 10 equations that describe with mathematical precision how gravity is not a force acting between objects, but a curvature in the fabric of space and time caused by the presence of mass. Most people hear that and mentally file it away as an interesting but abstract scientific fact. Something for physicists, something for textbooks, something that has nothing to do with the big questions, the questions about God, about existence, about the origin of everything. But that reaction is exactly the mistake, because hidden within those equations was an implication that Einstein himself took time to accept, one that disturbed him so much that he tried to modify his own equations to avoid it, and that, when it was finally confirmed by experimental observation, forced him to publicly acknowledge that he had made the greatest mistake of his scientific career. That implication was simple and brutal. The universe is not eternal. The universe had a beginning. Einstein's equations, when applied to the entire cosmos, did not describe a static and eternal universe, as everyone assumed. They described an expanding universe, a universe that grows. And if it is growing now, then in the past it was smaller. And if you go far enough back in time, you reach a point where everything, all matter, all energy, all space, was concentrated in a single point of infinite density, a beginning, a zero moment. And this is where I need you to stop reading this as though it were a television documentary and begin to feel the real weight of what we are talking about. Because what Einstein discovered was not only that the universe began, it was something much stranger, something the human language can barely contain without distorting it. What Einstein discovered is that time itself began at that moment. Time is not an eternal river that has always flowed from forever toward forever and within which the universe appeared at some point. Time is a dimension of the universe. Time is part of the fabric that was created in the Big Bang. Before the Big Bangio waiting, there was no darkness, there was nothing within which the universe could appear. There was no before, but pay very close attention to what comes now, because this is not a poetic statement, it is not a philosophical metaphor for avoiding a difficult question, it is the direct and mathematically verifiable consequence of the most rigorous physics humanity has produced. Stephen Hawking, one of the most important theoretical physicists of the 20th century, explained it with an analogy that became etched into the history of scientific thought. Asking what existed before the Big Bang is like asking what is south of the South Pole. There is no evasion in that answer. There is no hidden mystery that science still cannot reach. The question simply does not point toward any real place because the concept of south ceases to make sense at the South Pole, exactly as the concept of before ceases to make sense at the origin of time. And now observe what this does to the question we began with. If God created the universe, who created God? The question assumes that there was a moment when the universe did not exist. It assumes that at that moment something or someone made the decision to create it. It assumes that there was a time before time within which that act of creation could occur. But if time was born with the universe, all of those assumptions collapse at the same time. Not because the answer is difficult, but because the question is built on an image of time that physics has demonstrated to be incorrect. It is like trying to solve an equation that contains an error in its original formulation. It does not matter how brilliant you are, it does not matter how much effort you devote to it, the error is at the foundation, and everything you build on top of it will collapse. I remember the exact moment when this stopped being an intellectual fact for me and became something visceral. I was reading an explanation by Hawking in a book I had bought almost by accident in a used bookstore, one of those places that smell of damp paper and frozen time. And I reached the part where he described time as a dimension that was born with the universe, and I had to close the book, not because I did not understand it, but because I understood it too well, because at that moment I realized that I had spent my entire life asking questions about the origin of existence from within a mental framework that assumed time to be something eternal and given. And that framework was false. And all the questions I had built on that framework, including the most fundamental question of all, needed to be reformulated from scratch. That does not feel like an intellectual victory. It feels like discovering that the floor you have been walking on for years has a crack running all the way across it from one side to the other. And the only honest response to that moment is not to look for another firmer floor as quickly as possible, it is to stand for a moment on the crack and look down. There is something that most documentaries about Einstein never tell you. Something that debates between atheists and believers conveniently ignore. Something that makes both sides uncomfortable for completely different reasons. Einstein was not an atheist, and neither was he a believer in the sense that either side would like to claim as its own. When he was asked directly whether he believed in God, something he was asked constantly because the entire world wanted to know which side the most intelligent man of the century was on, he always answered with a precision that left everyone dissatisfied. He did not say yes, he did not say no, he said something that most people heard without really listening. He said that he believed in the God of Spinoza. And that is where the conversation became interesting, because most of the people who heard that did not know who Spinoza was, and those who did know often preferred not to examine more deeply what that reference actually implied, because what Spinoza proposed in the 10th century was an idea so radical, so uncomfortable for traditional religion and materialist atheism at the same time, that he was excommunicated from his Jewish community with the most severe curse that existed at the time. His own contemporaries called him an atheist. Modern atheists sometimes claim him as one of their own. And pantheists, a minority but profoundly serious philosophical tradition, consider him their most important figure. What exactly did Spinoza propose? He proposed that God and the universe are not two different things. It is not that God created the universe and then remained separate from it, observing it from the outside like a clockmaker who built a clock and left it to run on its own. For Spinoza, God is the universe. God is the totality of everything that exists. Nature as a whole, with all its laws, with all its complexity, with all its mathematical precision, is the manifestation of what we call God. This has a philosophical name. It is called pantheism, from the Greek pan, meaning everything, and theos, meaning God. God is everything. Everything is God. But pay very close attention to what comes now, because this is not simply an alternative religious position. It is not a gentler or more modern way of believing in the same old thing. It is a complete restructuring of the question of origin. And when you combine it with what Einstein discovered about time, it produces something that very few people have had the opportunity to contemplate clearly. If God and the universe are the same thing, then the question, who created God, becomes something like asking who created the totality of everything that exists, including time itself. And the answer is not that we do not know yet. The answer is that the question is using the concept of creation in a way that no longer works. Because creation implies a creator who exists before what is created, it implies an earlier time in which the act of creating occurred. But if the totality includes time, there is no outside from which something could have created that totality. There is no before from which someone could have acted. The question does not fail for lack of an answer, it fails because it demands a perspective external to everything that exists, and that perspective is impossible by definition. Einstein understood this. He did not always express it with the same philosophical clarity, but when he spoke about the God of Spinoza, when he described his religious experience as a profound awe before the harmony and order of the cosmos, he was describing exactly that, not a relationship with a personal being who listens to prayers and makes decisions, but a relationship of awe before existence itself, before the fact that there is something rather than nothing, before the mystery that this something follows. Mathematical laws of a precision that no human mind has yet fully understood. And I need to be honest with you at this point because it would be easy to present this as though it were a clean and satisfying solution, as though Einstein and Spinoza had settled the debate once and for all and now we could all go to sleep peacefully. That is not the case. Pantheism resolves the logical paradox, dissolves the poorly formulated question, but it does not satisfy the human brain. And there is a very specific reason for that. Our brains evolved to relate to agents, to beings that have intentions, to entities that decide, that plan, that respond. That is why when something happens to us, good or bad, our instinctive reaction is to ask who caused it, not what caused it who. Language itself reveals it. We say, the river took the bridge away, as if the river had an intention. We say, cancer chose me, as if the disease made decisions. That tendency to see agents everywhere has a name in cognitive psychology. It is called hyperactive agency detection, and it was enormously useful for surviving in an environment where predators hid among the bushes, but it becomes a serious obstacle when we try to think about something that is not an agent, something that has no intentions, no decisions, and no perspective of its own, existence itself, because existence did not decide to exist. The universe did not choose to begin. Time did not optic bang. There was no will behind that, in any sense that our brains can process naturally and intuitively. And there lies the true philosophical scandal hidden by this subject. It is not whether God exists or does not exist. It is that the category of existence, the most basic question of all, why is there something rather than nothing, seems to lie completely beyond the reach of human intuition. Not because we are unintelligent, but because we were designed by evolution to survive on an African savanna, not to contemplate the limits of time and causality. Einstein knew that, and that, more than any equation, is what made him different. He did not pretend to have answers where he did not know them. He had the rare and almost painful ability to remain comfortable within mystery without needing to close it with a false solution. That ability has a name, and it is exactly what this subject demands of anyone who wants to think about it honestly. I want to talk to you about something that does not usually appear in philosophical debates about God and the universe. Something intellectuals tend to ignore because admitting it does not look good. Something that I myself took a long time to acknowledge honestly. Most people are not looking for truth when they ask this question, they are looking for ammunition. The atheist who throws out "Who created God?" is not genuinely interested in exploring the limits of causality. He is looking for a way to win an argument, to prove that religion is internally contradictory, to shut up someone who makes him uncomfortable with questions about the meaning of life. And the believer who awkwardly avoids the question is not looking for truth either. He is protecting something, a certainty that gives him structure, a narrative that gives him comfort, a framework that allows him to get up every morning without having to look directly into the abyss of not knowing why there is something rather than nothing. Both are doing the same thing from opposite sides. Both are using the question as a shield. And I understand it, I truly understand it, because I did exactly that for years. I used philosophy as a way to feel smarter than people who believed without questioning, and I used spirituality as a way to feel deeper than those who denied without questioning. In neither case was I really searching for anything. I was constructing an identity. And that is exactly what this subject does to almost everyone. Because the question of the origin of existence is too large for the human ego. It is so large that instead of humbling us, as any question we genuinely cannot answer should, we tend to appropriate it, turn it into a flag, use it to define who we are and who we are not. The true philosophical scandal is not that we have no answer, it is that almost no one is truly willing not to have one. Because having no answer to the most fundamental question of existence is uncomfortable in a very specific way. It is not the discomfort of not knowing where you left your keys, it is the discomfort of standing on something with no visible bottom and having to keep standing there anyway because there is nowhere else to stand. Gottfried Leibniz, the German philosopher and mathematician of the 15th century, formulated what many consider the most fundamental question in all of metaphysics. Not why does God exist? Not why does the universe exist? But something more basic and more disturbing than all of that. Why is there something rather than nothing? Martin Heidegger, one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, said that this was the fundamental question of human thought, not one of the important questions. The question, the starting point of any serious reflection on reality, and modern quantum physics has approached the question in a way no previous philosophical or religious tradition could have anticipated. The concept of quantum vacuum fluctuations suggests that what we call nothing is not really nothing, that the quantum vacuum is a state of minimum, but not zero, energy. That particles and antiparticles can spontaneously appear from that vacuum and disappear in fractions of a second, that what we experience as emptiness is actually boiling with activity on subatomic scales. Lawrence Krauss, a theoretical physicist at Arizona State University, wrote an entire book about how the universe could have emerged from that kind of quantum vacuum without needing an external cause, without needing a creator, without needing a before in any meaningful sense. Does that resolve the question of the ibness? Not completely, because you can continue asking why that quantum vacuum with those specific properties exists instead of absolutely nothing existing at all. The problem moves back one step, but it does not disappear. And that is exactly what makes science honest when it works well. It does not pretend to have closed questions that are still open. If you have made it this far in this video, if you followed this path from the initial question to Einstein, from Einstein to Spinoza, from Spinoza to quantum physics, then you are already part of a very small minority. Most people give up much earlier, not because the subject is difficult, but because the subject demands something that modern culture does not train very well. It demands being comfortable with not knowing. So if this video moved something inside you, if it opened a crack in some certainty you were holding too tightly, share it. Not to win an argument, not to prove something to anyone, but because the conversations that truly matter are rare, and the people willing to have them are even rarer. And subscribe to the channel if you have not already, because this is exactly what we do here. Not give you easy answers, but take you to the edges of thought where easy answers stop working and something far more interesting begins. The bravest question you can ask is not, who created God? It is this: am I willing to truly think, even if that means reaching no comforting conclusion? If the answer is yes, you have already changed something fundamental in the way you relate to knowledge. And that is worth more than any answer. There is a specific moment in the lives of some people when something changes irreversibly. It is not necessarily a dramatic moment. There is no background music, there is no voice from heaven. It is simply the moment when you realize that a question you carried as though it were a truth was actually a trap, and that the trap was not outside, it was in the way you had learned to think. That is the moment this video tried to provoke in you, not to leave you with nothing, but to leave you with something more honest than what you had before. Let us review what really happened here, because it is worth seeing the whole thing before we finish. You arrived with a question that is 3,000 years old. A question that entire generations of philosophers, theologians, and scientists have used as a battlefield. If God created the universe, who created God? The Greeks used it to explore the nature of causality. Thomas Aquinas used it to build the intellectual architecture of medieval Catholicism. Bertrand Russell used it to dismantle that same architecture in the 20th century, and millions of people use it today in internet arguments that generate more heat than light. And what we discovered together is that all of them, without exception, were operating within an error that no one had pointed out with sufficient clarity. The error of assuming that time is the eternal container within which everything occurs. Einstein demonstrated that it is not, that time is a dimension of the universe, that it was born with the universe, that before the Big Bang patiently waiting for something to appear within it. That the very concept of before did not exist because time did not yet exist. And that is not a philosophical opinion, it is experimentally verified physics. It is the direct consequence of general relativity confirmed by decades of observation and measurement. It is as solid as any knowledge humanity has ever produced. Spinoza, centuries before Einstein and without the mathematical tools Einstein would have, arrived at a philosophical intuition that pointed in the same direction. If God and the universe are the same thing, if existence in its totality is what we call God, then asking who created God is asking who created the totality of everything that exists, including time and causality itself. And that question has no possible answer, not because the answer is difficult, but because the question demands a perspective from outside everything that exists, and that outside does not exist. Einstein said that he believed in the God of Spinoza, and now you know exactly what that means. It was not a diplomatic evasion. It was not a polite way of saying that he was an atheist without causing a scandal. It was a precise philosophical position. It was the assertion that the real mystery is not who made the universe, but why there is something rather than nothing, and that this mystery deserves or instead of fabricated answers. Quantum physics has come closer than any previous tradition to brushing against the edges of that question. Vacuum fluctuations, the spontaneous emergence of structure from states of minimum energy, the possibility that what we call nothing is actually a quantum state with specific properties. All of that pushes the frontier of knowledge into territories where everyday language begins to fail and mathematics is the only way to keep the conversation precise, but the frontier remains a frontier, and beyond it there is still darkness. And here is what I want to leave you with, not as an academic conclusion, but as something personal. I believe that the way a person relates to that darkness says more about them than any answer they could give. There are people who need to fill it at all costs. With God, with the Big Bang, with a simulation, with any narrative that closes the abyss and allows them to sleep peacefully. I do not judge them. The human brain was not designed to live comfortably above bottomless questions, but there is another way. It is Einstein's way, it is Spinoza's way, it is the way of the best physicists and philosophers who have brushed against these subjects without burning themselves or retreating. It is to treat the mystery as what it is, not as a problem that must be solved, not as a threat that must be neutralized with faith or with skepticism, but as the most direct evidence we have that reality is larger, stranger, and deeper than any human mind can completely contain. That is not intellectual defeat, it is the most honest form of intelligence that exists. You left this video without a definitive answer about God, without proof of his existence or his non-existence, without a winning argument for your next debate on social media. But if something worked as it should, you left with something more valuable than all of that. You left with a better question. And a better question is always the beginning of freer thought. That is all this video tried to do. To give you not an answer, but a more honest place from which to keep asking.